It's tough to know how to start a video like this, about something that is so important to you that you don't really know how to adequately put it into words. The Final Fantasy series means so much to so many people, and I definitely belong to that group. My absolute adulation for this series stems from the earliest memories I have. I was 4 years old in late 1999, and that's when I got the opportunity to experience Final Fantasy VIII for the first time. I remember sitting there watching the game's wonderful, intense cinematic opening, taking in the serenity of Balamut Garden, feeling unsettled by the eerie atmosphere of the Fire Cavern, and then being completely blown away by the cutscene that plays as your first real mission begins when you land on the beaches at Dollet. And it was right then, as that cutscene played out, that my obsession with this series truly and irreversibly began. Since then, Final Fantasy has, and I mean this in the best possible way, consumed my life. My early childhood was spent playing Final Fantasy VIII, IX, and X on repeat, and my teenage years were spent searching out and experiencing the other Final Fantasy games I'd never had the opportunity to play before, and I just loved every single moment of it. One thing I've always wanted to do is share my love for this series with other people, and try and communicate just what it is that Final Fantasy ultimately means and represents, and why people gravitate towards these games so much. So, what I've ultimately decided to do is go through it all really, take it step by step, and comprehensively look at the series from its pioneering first entry to the present day, examining with a fine-tooth comb all of the most important games throughout the series' history. It's going to be quite a journey. So, before we get going, I think it goes without saying that this video will contain massive spoilers for the whole game, and the same will be the case for all the other videos in the series too. Now that you know, let's jump into the first entry in this wonderful series, Final Fantasy. The very first Final Fantasy game was released all the way back in 1987, developed and published by a video game company called Square. It's important to realise that at this time, video games, at least in terms of home consoles, were very much in their infancy. Nintendo's release of the Famicom in 1983 ended up leading to massive success, and unlike Nintendo's first attempt at a home console, the Color TV game, the Famicom's popularity led to a release in the West, although under a different name, the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the NES. The NES grew to be enormously popular, and it was on this console that Final Fantasy first made its mark. After a run of bad fortune, Square's director of planning and development, a certain Hironobu Sakaguchi, pitched the idea for a role-playing game, an idea influenced by games such as Ultima, Wizardry, and above all others, Enix's iconic 1986 release, Dragon Quest. And so, Square began work on Final Fantasy. But interestingly enough, it wasn't always called that. The initial idea for the series was that it would actually be called Fighting Fantasy, which was ultimately changed, and the reason for that seems to have become a bit of a video game myth, which some of you will have undoubtedly heard. What you tend to hear is that because it was Sakaguchi's last chance at success in the industry, he fittingly named the title Final, but this was actually debunked by Sakaguchi himself in a 2015 interview with the renowned Japanese gaming publication Famitsu. There's an urban legend that the Final in FF meant that this was our last project. While we were having some hard times back then, the truth is that as long as the title could be shortened to FF, any word would have sufficed. It was initially going to be Fighting Fantasy, but there was already a board game out with the same name. Just to make things a bit more complicated, the game's composer, Nobuo Uematsu, said in an interview with Wired in 2009 that these rumours actually had an element of truth to them. It's true that Sakaguchi was going to quit, he said, but the bigger reason, the real reason, was that Square was going to go bankrupt and the designers believed that it would be the company's swan song. For the most part, all this does is confuse things really, but the one thing that does seem to ring true in both of these statements is that Final Fantasy was really up against it, and became a huge success against all odds, and as a result, it really put both the names of Square and Final Fantasy itself on the map. Now, as the progenitor of one of the most iconic and important video game series in history, it's not surprising to hear that the first Final Fantasy game has been paid a lot of retroactive attention, if you will, by way of remakes and re-releases. And so, one of the things I'd like to briefly discuss with you before we head into the game proper is which versions or editions of this game are available to play, what the pros and cons are, and which I would ultimately recommend if you were to try the game out for yourself. Of all the games in the series, the first is probably the one where you have the largest set of options to choose from. That being said, the ones I would consider most worth your time are the original NES version, Final Fantasy Origins on the PS1, Final Fantasy Dawn of Souls on the GBA, and the 20th anniversary release on the PSP. So, the original is definitely worth playing, but isn't necessarily the most user-friendly at points, and could definitely be a shock to the system if you aren't acclimatized to games from that period in gaming history. Origins improves on a lot, particularly from a graphical standpoint, but also includes a remixed soundtrack and even FMVs, but it doesn't stray as far from the original in some other regards as the future releases do. so would probably be your best bet if you want to experience something closer to the original with slightly more polish. The GBA version added multiple quality of life improvements, such as a revamped and more recognisable magic system, being able to save anywhere, and most importantly, a really decent new script translation. And finally, the PSP version keeps all the most important fixes made in the previous iterations, whilst also overhauling the graphics and music once again. There's also more optional endgame content, if that's your kind of thing. Now that you have the info, the choice is yours really, but for the purposes of this video I'll be basing my analysis predominantly off the original NES version, because I mean it is the original, but I'll also be using the PSP version for cross-reference when relevant or required. Okay, finally, it's time to dive in. Let's start it up. The first thing you get hit with as you load up any edition of the game is this wonderful piece of music, the prelude. Have a listen. This is such a brilliant, simple, and iconic piece of music that is so instantly evocative of the beginning of a journey. There's a certain minimalism and purity which pervades this song, immediately engendering a feeling of hope, but also conveying a realistic sense of a journey's scale, with this undulation between highs and lows representing the toll your quest will take on you, and the unavoidable ups and downs that accompany every Final Fantasy story. An amazing fact about this song is that Uematsu actually wrote it in no time at all. In an interview in 2014, he was asked, "What do you remember about the first track on Final Fantasy, Prelude?" And he said, "Around the time I worked on that, I'd just finished making all the music and thought everything was complete. Then my boss, Hironobu Sakaguchi, suddenly came into the room and told me to make one more song for the opening screen. He gave me 30 minutes. I remember rushing to make it right there. I never dreamed that song would continue to be used in the Final Fantasy series." We'll touch more on Uematsu later, as other noteworthy songs pop up, but even before we get into any more of this analysis, it's worth keeping a mental note of just how important he was to the success of this game and the series as a whole. And, with my fanboying over, let's finally have a look at the title screen. It says, "The world is veiled in darkness, the wind stops, the sea is wild, and the earth begins to rot. The people wait, their only hope, a prophecy. When the world is in darkness, 4 warriors will come. After a long journey, 4 young warriors arrive, each holding an orb." So what you see on screen now, what I've just read out, is about the extent of the context you get for the story prior to starting the game. Nowadays, Final Fantasy is regarded as a pioneering series when it comes to narrative progression in games, and for good reason, but this can only really be applied to the series from Final Fantasy IV and onwards. Final Fantasy I is not really a game which has the ability to fall back on its story as a safety net, because the narrative thread holding the game together is pretty thin. We'll get to that in a sec. Before that though, I'd like to discuss one of Final Fantasy I's defining characteristics, its distinctive lack of a main character. So instead of being provided with a protagonist and party members, you make your own in this game, and get the opportunity to name them too. You have 4 slots in your team, and the option of 6 class archetypes. You have the Fighter, the Black Belt, the Thief, the Red Mage, the Black Mage, and the White Mage. All of these are recognisable classes from JRPGs as a whole, but this is where it all really started. The Black Belt class is more commonly referred to as a monk now, at least within the Final Fantasy series, but the others are pretty immediately familiar if you have experience with the genre. What makes this work above all else though is that being able to immediately customise your party exactly to your liking provides you with a pretty instant connection with them. Generally, you have to take time to warm to party members, but picking out the 4 classes you want, naming them, and being put directly into the game helps to develop an instant rapport between you and them. When it comes to what classes you should pick, it's a very subjective choice, and there aren't really many wrong answers. Across both versions you'll see on screen, I've made sure to use every character at least once in each party, just to show that every individual character does have utility, even if some are better than others. I'm not going to tell you who to use, but we'll get more into the thought process behind character choice as we delve further into combat later in the video. So after you've chosen your characters, you're dropped quite suddenly and unceremoniously onto the world map, with very little to go on aside from a town and castle directly in front of you. It doesn't take much to figure out that the game is inviting you in. You find out shortly after entering that this is the town of Coneria, which leads me onto something you'll be seeing a fair bit throughout this video. Let's call it linguistic cross-referencing. Final Fantasy for the NES suffers from what we'll call an occasional case of bad translation. In future versions of the game, Coneria is universally referred to as Cornelia, which rolls off the tongue much more comfortably for native English speakers. But why was this change made? Why was it wrong in the first place? One of the most helpful things to do when wrestling with bizarre localization is to look at the original source material, which in this case is Japanese. Katakana, in case you don't know, is one of the 3 main Japanese syllabaries, alongside hiragana and kanji. The purpose of katakana is really interesting because one of its functions is to facilitate the transcription of foreign words and loanwords into Japanese. Think of it like italics in English. It helps to clearly delineate the components within a sentence to make its meaning more understandable. Let's look at the katakana for Cornelia. So this reads as ko, with a line meaning that the prior syllable is stressed, and then ne, ri, which is very hard to correctly pronounce. What I've said isn't exactly right, but it's like a mixture between an R and an L and a D. And then finally, a. So this is why translation and localization is so interesting, because going by the Japanese, we find out that the initial translation of Cornelia isn't actually that wrong, even though in comparison to Cornelia, it definitely sounds worse. Part of this is the letter R in Cornelia acting in place of the lengthened syllable at the end of the ko katakana, making the word's pronunciation more natural and fluid. Something I don't see enough in the general discourse around games is a discussion about language and how important the role it plays actually is. Immersion is one of the most important parts of game design philosophy, especially when it comes to fantasy, and how legitimate and believable the language field plays a massive role in that. Another example from this opening town is the phrase light warriors, which gets bandied about for the entire duration of the game. Technically, there isn't much wrong with this. It makes sense, but suddenly feels a bit iffy when compared to the much more natural Warriors of Light that you see in the PSP version. This is because from a syntactic standpoint, possession can work pretty differently in both English and Japanese, with Japanese using a particle that goes after the noun it qualifies. For example, hikari no, with no being the possessive particle, and English sometimes reverses this structure, using the preposition of before the noun. In translation studies, this kind of thing is referred to as a calque, when translation is too literal or too word for word, and doesn't focus enough on being idiomatic in the target language. But again, why is this actually important? Aside from the immersion I mentioned earlier, the other main reason is for the sake of clarity, considering how this game conveys its information. A few minutes back, I mentioned that Final Fantasy didn't have much story to fall back on, and that the narrative thread that binds everything is thin, which is something I'd like to explain a bit further now. Most stories that you get told in video games nowadays are of a more passive variety. The word passive does slightly imply negativity, but it isn't actually negative at all. Almost all visual media tells its stories passively, but video games can allow something different, a slightly more active style of storytelling. How much you get out of Final Fantasy I's narrative is basically up to you, and how much you're willing to engage with the world. Optional NPC interaction makes up the heavy majority of story progression and world building, and although it can sometimes seem unclear, every piece of information you would need for the context of the story, and where you need to go next, is technically available. You just probably need to note down what every single NPC you speak to says, and sometimes you also need an uncanny ability to translate dodgy localization. Soon we'll get into an example of one of these NPC quest chains, but before that I think it's time that we move on with the story a little bit, yeah? So, when you head to the castle and chat to the king, you find out that Garland has kidnapped the princess. That's about all the info you get from him, but if you go and ask around, you can find out that Garland used to be a good knight, and that he holds the princess in a temple to the northwest. Already, the intrigue is building. The game has started with pretty high stakes with betrayal and kidnapping, so you mosey on over to this temple to the northwest, called the Temple of Fiends, by the way, and there you find Garland. Now, this is totally personal preference bleeding in here, but something about the sentence, "I, Garland, will knock you all down," is just incredible. In the PSP version, even though they gave him more dialogue for the sake of exposition, they kept this particular sentence exactly the same, and I think that was the perfect choice. There's something about the wording of it, the confidence exuding from it, the weird choice of verb, that succinctly introduces who this villain is. Garland is cocksure, brash, wields his superiority complex like a weapon, and you can tell all of this just from this one proclamation. The writing in Final Fantasy I often leaves a lot to be desired, but honestly this is one of my favourite pieces of dialogue in the whole game, if not my favourite. In a shocking turn of events though, beating Garland is a piece of piss, and you kill him pretty quickly for 4 randoms with seemingly no battle experience. It might seem a letdown now, but it kind of makes sense later on. We'll get there. But for now, Princess Sarah takes you back to the castle and the king rebuilds a bridge to the northern continent so you can continue your quest. When you cross it, you see this screen, and this wonderful piece of music begins to play. In wanting to talk a bit about the music from the game, I'd be very remiss to not discuss the main theme of Final Fantasy. If you're a fan of this series like I am, then you will understand just how important and powerful this song is, and the reaction that it can inspire in you when you hear it. This song has gone on to feature in most, although not all, future main series Final Fantasy games, and the impact it has whenever it plays is just palpable. In a conversation with IGN about his own work, Uematsu stated this: "The theme from Final Fantasy is basically the song I'd like to be remembered by. I think it's very soft and warm, but there's a strength to it. It's appealing, and I think it's the most important song in terms of everything I've ever done." Well, you're not going to hear me disagreeing with him. We'll discuss some of the future iterations of the theme in later videos, but for now all we need to know is that this song sums up what Final Fantasy is. I know that probably sounds like really bullshit analysis, and it kind of is, but I promise you that after more of these videos as we go further into the series, it will make more sense. So now that we're past the introductory stage of the game, I'm going to step in and briefly explain what our modus operandi throughout Final Fantasy I actually is, because I haven't done that yet, and the game doesn't do the best job of explaining it either. So in the fictional universe in which Final Fantasy takes place, there are 4 forces that govern the natural world: Earth, Fire, Water, and Wind or Air. These concepts are represented physically through crystals, which is probably the most ubiquitous JRPG trope that exists. If you cast your mind back to the opening screen of the game, it did say stuff like, "The sea is wild," and "The earth begins to rot." This is because the power of the crystals has been diminished by these creatures called the 4 fiends. Now, for some reason which I don't really know, your party members all start the game holding a darkened crystal, one of each aforementioned element, and your task is to defeat the fiends and return the crystals to their former glory. In the NES version, these crystals are called orbs, which is bizarre because the katakana in the original version does spell out crystal. Whether this truncated translation was decided upon as a result of cutting down on letters, or because the crystals in the menu are definitely spherical, I can't say, but for the purposes of this video we'll be referring to them as crystals. So, if the aim of the game is to restore these crystals, what are you going to be doing in the interim? What makes up the bulk of the playtime? The answer is combat. A lot of it. As you travel through the overworld or through dungeons, enemies can pop up and attack you. Random battles like this were the staple in JRPGs for a long time, but the system has fallen out of favour slightly as the medium has developed, being found much less frequently in modern games. As for the battle system itself, Final Fantasy made use of and pioneered the permutation of the turn-based battle system, which plopped the enemies on one side and your party on the other, as opposed to a first-person view, which was more common in other JRPGs at the time, like Dragon Quest for example. Nowadays this is seen as normal, but it was definitely novel in 1987. This battle system was created by Hiroyuki Ito, who explained his creative process in an interview with 1UP. Basically, there's no one inspiration that I got that battle system from. It was just a logical process where I thought, how can I create an efficient battle system for a role-playing game? And that's the answer I came to. At the root of it all though, there's a basic kind of system that comes from professional sports. He was then asked which sport in particular he was referring to, and he said, yeah, the NFL. American football is probably the closest thing. Contextually, this totally makes sense. The engaging concept of back and forth he mentions from American football is an almost universally consistent feature amongst the world's biggest sports, and is part of why turn-based combat worked so well after its inception, and in my opinion still works really well. Basing a battle system off a pre-existing social paradigm that everyone understands pretty inherently is genius, because it means that the initial barrier standing between you and understanding the idea behind the combat almost doesn't exist. The notion of you have a go, then they have a go is found in almost every variation of games and play that there is. This might seem like a really obvious point, but Final Fantasy struck the balance perfectly between innovation and recognizability. The battle system in Final Fantasy I is super accessible and easy to comprehend, which is definitely one of its largest strengths. This is more from a conceptual perspective though, rather than from an actually hands-on perspective. Combat in this game isn't necessarily the most intuitive in practice, partly because of hardware limitations which we'll speak about soon, but also in part because of the battle system's other largest influence alongside sports, Dungeons & Dragons. Now, if you're watching this and you know this game well, this will not at all come as a surprise to you. If you're a big D&D fan who doesn't know much about this game, you're going to find yourself in familiar territory pretty frequently. Final Fantasy's nascent battle system takes a lot of inspiration from tabletop RPGs, and here are the 2 main ways it does. First and foremost, Final Fantasy pretty much straight up nicked the spell slots system from D&D. Most future entries in the series use some form of the more well-known MP or magic points system, but the original Final Fantasy works off the basis of having a set number of spells that you can use up. Magic works in levels, so there are 8 levels of spells, with the spells within each level becoming stronger as the level gets higher. So, for example, Fire is a level 1 spell, but Nuke, the strongest black magic spell in the game, is a level 8 spell. As you level up, your capacity for more spells increases, maxing out at 9 charges per level before you would have to go and rest up at an inn to regain them. This is all kind of hard to explain, so I hope it's making sense. Some later versions of Final Fantasy I changed this system to the MP system that I mentioned earlier, which is why you can see charges in the NES version on screen, but MP on the PSP version. The second way in which inspiration was taken pretty heavily from D&D was that almost every monster in the game, even the 4 fiends, can be found in either the 1977 or 1983 monster manuals, which if you don't know are supplementary books which give additional info about the monsters used throughout D&D. This is pretty interesting because Final Fantasy and D&D share something in common here, closely overlapping in this game but separating more as the games go on, which is heavily basing their monsters and world building on things from history, mythology, or folklore. We'll go into this a bit later in this video, an analysis of this will actually make up a fair chunk of the content to come in the series. Anyway, this crossover from D&D is why a lot of the elements in Final Fantasy I come across as more stereotypically Western, which is something that doesn't apply as much as the series progresses and finds more of its own identity. In this case, however, a lot of it is definitely a copy and paste job. Nowadays, if you wanted to create a bestiary and a battle system for your fantasy world, you'd have a bit more inspiration to draw from, but at the time, there was little better to base your burgeoning fantasy franchise off. I mean, looking at Final Fantasy I now, in a lot of ways it almost comes across as an attempted video game adaptation of Dungeons & Dragons. All this doesn't mean that there isn't a level of original charm and nuance within the battle system though, because there is charm and nuance, even though it's sometimes hard to find under the rampant issues and glitches pervading the game's combat. A lot of the enemy and boss sprite work is actually really impressive, especially compared to some other games at the time, and manages to pretty accurately convey the ideas put forward by Yoshitaka Amano's concept art. There are also smaller aesthetic things, like individual weapon animations depending on what you have equipped, which give the battles a lot more character and variety from a visual standpoint. However, if we were going to try and describe Final Fantasy I's combat in one word, say, and we were trying to be kind about it, we'd probably end up at something like deliberate. It is pretty slow, arduous, and challenging, and you really have to make each hit count. Something we maybe take for granted nowadays in JRPGs is that if multiple party members attack an enemy, and the enemy is defeated before all party members had a chance to attack it, the game will automatically redirect any remaining attack to hit another enemy. Because, well, obviously, right? Final Fantasy I does not do this. There's a bit more kindling as well we can add to this fire of inconvenience. Unfortunately, some of the spells either do not work as advertised, or pretty much do nothing at all. The spell Temper, for example, is meant to raise an ally's attack stat. It just doesn't do anything. The intelligence stat, shortened to INT or INT, is meant to be used to factor in how much damage a spell will do or how much health a spell will heal, but the game never uses it when taking that into account, so it's pointless having it. Combined with a charge system that hinders the overall utility of magic and mages in the game, this doesn't make too much of a convincing argument for using a mage-based party. A lot of the weapons are supposed to have secondary effects too. A few examples are the Coral Sword, which is meant to do more damage to sea-based creatures, or the Dragon Sword, which you guessed it, is meant to do more damage to dragon-based enemies. None of these secondary effects actually have any effect in the game, for any weapon. Alongside balancing issues, all of this culminates to there being a weird sort of artificial difficulty all the way throughout the game. And one of the best instances of this is found on your journey to rid the world of the first of the 4 fiends. Lich, the Fiend of Earth. It doesn't come as much of a surprise, but the Lich fight takes place in the lowest floor of a dungeon called the Earth Cave. Given that the game is based around defeating these 4 immensely powerful monsters, you'd maybe be surprised to find that beating the Lich is honestly really not that difficult. You know what is difficult? Getting there. You have to go into the Earth Cave, beat a mini-boss, then backtrack out of the Earth Cave, go get an item to help you further into the cave, then go all the way back to the mini-boss area, and then down another wee while before you get to the boss. Outside of this frustrating way in which they've lengthened the game by making you do this dungeon twice, also bear in mind that Phoenix Downs don't exist in this game. The only way to revive a dead character is either by going to one of the churches you can find in towns and paying to be resurrected, or by using the life spell, which at this current point in the game you would likely have very few charges of, if you had it at all, and all of that is assuming that you had a white mage in your party. Getting ambushed by a large group of enemies is par for the course throughout the game, and you've just got to really hope that they don't attack your weaker characters, because it happens relatively frequently that you will enter a battle with a good amount of health, be ambushed, and just die. One helpful feature that you can use to your advantage is that the position of your party members actually determines the likelihood of them being attacked. There's a 50% chance of enemies attacking the first person in your party, the one at the top, which is why it's always a good idea to have a fighter in that spot, because they have the best defensive capabilities. But having discussed a wee bit about the Earth Cave and the Lich fight now, haven't we missed a bit out? How did we get there? The last plot point we discussed before this was when we crossed that bridge right at the start. I think this is the perfect time to bring up a bit more about how Final Fantasy I gives you the information you need to proceed. We're going to imagine ourselves right at the beginning again, just as we've defeated Garland and we're preparing to head out into the big scary world. So in Cornelia, assuming you talk to everyone, you can find out that there's a place called Provoca to the east, and that there's someone called Matoya to the north, and that she needs the crystal to see. In the PSP version, it's elucidated that this is a crystal eye, and that she is blind without it. So that's two possible avenues to explore. If you go and see Matoya to the north, you can find out that someone has stolen her crystal eye. Now, if you head to Provoca, that town to the east, you can find out that the elves live across the sea, Matoya's herb is the only thing that will wake their prince. By now, you can see the pieces of a puzzle starting to form. Earlier, in Cornelia Castle, we were told by someone that this mystic key was given to the Prince of Elfland for safekeeping. So, if we can get Matoya's crystal eye back, she might give us the herb, or Jolt tonic in the PSP version, to wake up the prince and get this key. Looking at the game from a distance, the entire narrative is made up of these small NPC interaction-based microcosms, each one helping you progress further and influencing the way you interact with the world. Getting the Mystic Key allows you to progress further in the game, to the point where you can reach the Earth Cave and take on the Lich fight. It's relatively non-linear in structure in the sense that it's an open world that you can pretty much explore at your leisure, but the game isn't actually that big, and there aren't really any places that aren't relevant to some sort of story thread or relevant to getting some kind of item to help you progress. So even if you have absolutely no idea where you're going or what you're meant to be doing, you will eventually be able to indirectly figure it out by process of elimination. That being said, figuring out what to do next with the available clues is genuinely super satisfying, and makes the game pretty fun to play in a lot of ways. Knowing that every piece of info you receive could end up being vital down the line is exciting and makes you pay attention and actually try and problem solve. So, how about we move on to the next of the 4 fiends? After you beat the Lich, you can actually go and do any of the remaining 3 boss fights in whichever order you want, and in the footage you might notice that I do actually do the boss fights out of order. But for the purposes of this video, we'll discuss them in order. Which means that next on the agenda is Carrie, the Fiend of Fire, and the boss fight that confuses me more than anything else in this whole game. Why does it confuse me, I hear you not ask? Convoluted battle mechanics, maybe? Is it an insanely hard fight? It's neither of those. It's her name. I just don't get it. In every other version of the game after the original NES release, Carrie is called Marilith. A Marilith is a fictional creature from Dungeons & Dragons loosely based off Hindu mythology. That's all fine. Knowing that, you can actually look at the name Carrie and figure out that it's meant to be Kali. Kali is the Hindu goddess of death and destruction, among other things, who shares some physical characteristics with Carrie or Marilith, mostly in the sense of having multiple sets of arms and wielding scimitars. So knowing what we do now about the localization in this game, with what we saw in the Cornelia mistranslation, the name Carrie must just be a localization error too, right? Based on the potential ambiguity of the RL sound when translating back into English, right? It turns out, no. In the Japanese version of Final Fantasy I for the NES, she was called Marilith. For years, I'd just assumed that it was simply a localization error that led to Kali being misconstrued as Carrie, but it turns out that there is absolutely no discernible reason for this mistake. As you'll see later in the series, Final Fantasy is not a set of games that shies away from pretty oblique and obvious references to mythological figures, so I don't see any reason why this obfuscation of her name would be deliberate. The chances are that it was some sort of really bizarre, inexplicable oversight, but nonetheless, I find it really interesting that in a game where almost all obvious localization issues can be pretty easily understood by checking the original Japanese, this stands out as the exception to that rule. Anyway, let's move on from that nonsense. Well, at least partly. At the beginning of that previous segment, I did allude to the non-linearity that the game affords you in its second half, and now I'd like to go into what it is that makes this possible. The airship. Again, if you're a fan of this series, you'll know that airships are one of the most established and essential components of the overall Final Fantasy experience. The freedom that you finally get to feel for the first time after attaining the airship is always an unforgettable moment in each Final Fantasy playthrough, regardless of which game in the series you're playing. So, obtaining the airship does end up being a requirement for beating the game, but you start getting clues for how to obtain it a fair while before it's actually available. Think back to that wee questline from before involving Matoya, the Elven Prince, and the Mystic Key. Getting your mitts on the airship follows a relatively similar structure. Back in the Dwarf Cave, an area you get to shortly after obtaining the Mystic Key, one of the dwarves mentions something called the Floater, with which he could float anything. Now this seems like pretty innocuous drivel at the time, but ends up being pretty important. When you reach Melmond, the town immediately after the Dwarf Cave, someone says that ancient people used a stone to make their ship float. So we now know at least that if we can get our hands on this floater, which was called the Levistone in future editions by the way, then we should be able to make a ship airborne. Later on, if you head back to Elfland and chat to the locals again, you'll get two more vital pieces of info. Firstly, that a cave north of a volcano is where you'll find the stone, and the place you need to use that stone is in the desert south of the Crescent, which refers to the town Crescent Lake. With these 4 pieces of information, you have all the knowledge you need to acquire the airship. I usually find that the whole piecing together information thing can be a really fun aspect of the game, but this particular instance is one of the best examples of it because the reward feels more tangible than just about any other that you get throughout. Most other questlines in this game, despite being decent pseudo-puzzles, do feel somewhat arbitrary, and even with the active role you play in figuring out what you should be doing, it ultimately never ends up feeling like you're doing more than a few glorified fetch quests, only to be able to go on to another area and repeat the process. The journey there is often better than the destination. But getting the airship is different. Exhilarating is probably too strong a word, but getting in it for the first time and zooming around is definitely a thrill, and the only thrill of its like in the whole Final Fantasy I experience. It almost feels like you've been given a break, in a way. Final Fantasy I is a pretty intense game. Not always the most user-friendly, not always the fairest, not always the most fun, but getting the airship, that's some top-notch stuff. I imagine it was this feeling that led to the airship becoming such a series staple, which leads me on to my next point, and something you may have noticed if you're a serious fan who hasn't played this particular entry. Maybe you've asked yourself, where's all the classic Final Fantasy stuff? Now this is a pretty fair question. It's actually a bit weird to start this series with Final Fantasy I, even though it was the first and makes sense chronologically, because Final Fantasy I is, in many ways, one of the biggest outliers in the whole series. A lot of the most beloved and recognisable tropes and features throughout the Final Fantasy series are unfortunately absent in this game. Chocobo and Moogles? Nowhere to be found. Cactuars and Tomberries? Nope. There's no character called Cid, unless you count the blatant retcon you can find in this line of dialogue in the PSP version. Biggs and Wedge don't appear for a while yet. A lot of the more common thematic ideas that connect some of the later games are missing here because the series hasn't taken off its narrative training wheels yet, but the core idea of heroes defeating evil is still present in this first entry, which we'll dive into a bit deeper at the end. There are still things from this game that have endured throughout the series though, of course. The airship we've just spoken about being one of the most obvious examples. There are some sci-fi elements later in the game that definitely laid some of the groundwork for future entries in the series going down that route. And probably most importantly, a lot of the playable character classes are still super recognisable, the white mages and black mages in particular. I mean, you've probably noticed, but I'm pretty keen on the black mage design. I main a black mage in Final Fantasy XIV, my channel icon is a black mage, and Vivi from Final Fantasy IX, alongside Laguna from Final Fantasy VIII, is probably my favourite character in anything, ever. I wouldn't have any of that if it weren't for this game and this specific design. Although a lot of what makes Final Fantasy didn't stem from this game, there's enough here to still get across what kind of enduring legacy Sakaguchi and co were starting to set up. One more thing you might recognise, although summons don't feature in this particular entry, is a certain King of the Dragons. The fan favourite Bahamut does appear in this game, but not in the manner in which we're most acclimatised to. He's an NPC. If you manage to find him, he will ask you to provide him with proof of your courage, as vague as that is, and if we do so, we will receive the honour due true warriors. So chatting to another nearby dragon tells us that the place we ought to do this in is a castle to the northeast. This dungeon isn't actually very difficult, but it does make me want to discuss the game's overall dungeon design for a sec. The reason I'm bringing this up at this particular area, funny enough just about the only place in the game which isn't actually required to complete the story, is because of how ahead of their time some of the ideas underpinning the design were. The first floor you have to make your way through here is a memory puzzle essentially, where you have to keep guessing which path is the right one to take, and if you're wrong, you get sent back to the start. Playing this part always makes me think of Sabrina's Gym in the first generation Pokemon games, because, well, it's pretty much the exact same concept. I've always found the dungeon design in Final Fantasy I to have some impressive moments of innovation, all in all, despite it not always working perfectly, or despite it sometimes still being a bit primitive. In Mount Gulg, the dungeon where you fight Kari, or Kali, or Marilith, whatever, you often have to walk across lava to reach your destination, with each tile you step on doing a tick of damage to you, which obviously builds up over time. The Ice Cave has the same concept, with ice instead of lava. Although this sounds like a kind of irritating Wii gameplay mechanic, I'm going to explain why I think it's actually a pretty good idea. You see, Final Fantasy I's dungeons are marred by two big problems. One is the overabundance of random battles, and the other is a lack of variety in map layout. It depends on the floor and dungeon in question, of course, but a lot of Final Fantasy I's dungeons have branching paths, most just dead ends, and one correct path which ends up often not being that far away from where you start. If you end up exploring dead ends for ages, being beaten into submission by enemy ambushes, that's pretty shit. If you just find the exit to the floor straight away, it's not really much of a dungeon, is it? That's where these damage tiles come in, because they add a different element to the floors they're on, a bit of balance that's desperately needed. The main thing is that although the tiles damage you, you can't get random encounters on them. You're finally forced to actually consider your options and make the decision that you think is best. Sometimes it's mandatory to cross over the damaging tiles, but take a look at this floor. This is floor B2 in Mount Gulg. It has a lot of what I mentioned earlier. A lot of potential paths, some dead ends, some treasure chests too, but most importantly, the very bottom of this map has a straight path across to the next floor without taking the long way around. You can, with very few random encounters, just skip most of this floor, but for the price of taking a wee bit of damage. You've got to consider things like, is getting to the next floor with guaranteed damage taken better than risking it with enemy encounters? And should I access the next floor as soon as possible, even though it might mean missing out on some potential goodies from the chests? I personally found that the floors with these damaging tiles on them were consistently the most interesting areas in dungeons from a design and layout perspective, and added much needed variety and player consideration into what was otherwise somewhat stale dungeon planning. Anyway, let's backtrack a bit. The reason I brought all that up was because we were heading to that castle to bring back some proof of our courage for Bahamut. When you get to the end and open up the chest, what you find inside is an item called a tail. Looking at other editions of the game, we get the clarification that it's actually a rat's tail. One of the dragons near Bahamut did say that the proof of your courage might be anything, so I guess we can't be too surprised, but it does seem a bit out of left field. I think the idea of the item seeming arbitrary but representing something larger is a pretty nice idea, which I can definitely get behind. Kind of like a the strength was within you the whole time kind of deal. The reward you get for doing this is second only to the airship though. Bahamut rewards you with an upgrade to each of your classes, with the fighter becoming the knight, the black mage becoming the black wizard, and so on. This allows each character to use a wider variety of equipment, and in some cases gain the ability to learn a bit of magic. It's a really cool idea, and one the series adapts slightly into the job system that we'll see in future episodes in the series. Funny enough, the series also recycles the rat's tail item too, often being used as an item that seems innocuous, but ends up being pretty valuable or helpful. Again, we'll come across them later down the line. Anyway, that's been quite enough mucking about. How about we go and take on the third of the four fiends? This time, it's the Fiend of Water, the Kraken. If I'm being totally honest, there is not too much interesting to say about this fight. So I'm going to be a bit cheeky and segue it into talking about something a bit different. Something that we've not spoken about yet. What I'm talking about is this song. This is the Victory Fanfare, possibly the most recognisable jingle from the whole Final Fantasy series, and maybe even one of the most recognisable from games on the whole. Some permutation of this tune is used in most about every Final Fantasy game to signify the successful end of a battle. But why is this song important? The basic reason is because you hear it repeatedly, just over and over as you play the games from this series. And after a while, I think everyone who plays these games falls victim to at least a little bit of subconscious conditioning. The Victory Fanfare is essentially an auditory way of providing you with repeated positive feedback, like a dog being given a treat after sitting and holding out its paw or something like that. It says something to both this idea of conditioning and Uematsu's composition that I have been playing these games almost non-stop for 20 odd years, and I am yet to ever get sick of hearing this wee tune. It's genius because it just makes you instantly feel a sense of accomplishment. And not to get too deep with it, but at the end of the day, isn't that why we're all playing games, really? So, I know we've skipped over the Kraken slightly, but that does mean we only have one fiend left. There's just one small problem though. We need to learn a language first. As with everything in this game, this all starts with another questline. In Onrak, the town from which you enter the Sunken Shrine, the place you fought the Kraken, two NPCs will give you some pretty esoteric information. Firstly, that this guy called Dr. Une could teach this language if he had the slab, and that when the shrine sank, many treasures were lost, including a cryptic stone plate. Now this is understandable, but instances like this make me glad that I chose to use the PSP version to cross-reference. We find out that Lefanish has been changed to Lufenian, that the slab is meant to be the Rosetta Stone, and that we can definitely find it in the Sunken Shrine. I'll be calling all this stuff by its PSP nomenclature, by the way. Anyway, the Sunken Shrine is a slightly different dungeon to some of the others because you start on the middle floor. The Kraken lives on the bottom floor, so we're going to head to the top. This is where we find the Rosetta Stone, and also loads of mermaids. It doesn't really add much to the story or overall game, but I found the dialogue pretty interesting in this area. More than one of the mermaids talks about turning into bubbles and disappearing, and in the PSP version we can see that more specifically they'll turn into sea foam. This was actually a really helpful clarification because it makes it much more obvious that the game is trying to allude to Hans Christian Andersen's original story of The Little Mermaid, in which mermaids turn into sea foam and cease to exist when they die. Again, although this doesn't do much for the overall story, it's still noteworthy because it's a small insight into how the world-building process went for this game. Like with basing monsters off mythology and folklore, this isn't much different. Final Fantasy I has gone all in with the fantasy tropes, with dwarves, elves, dragons, and now that they're dropping mermaids into the game as well, they've taken inspiration from probably the most well-known mermaid story of all time, to build up a bit more background and realism into that part of their world. Anyway, that was a truly dogshit joke, and I'm sorry. We'll have really way to take the emphasis out of that point. But now that we have the Rosetta Stone, we can take it back to Dr. Une, a scholar we met earlier in the game, and we gain the ability to speak Lufenian in just a few seconds. Pretty jealous of that retention rate, to be honest. Anyway, our group of polyglots now all head over to Lefane, or Lufenia in later versions, a secluded town hidden away from anything else, now with the ability to speak to the locals. What I find way more interesting than that, though, is what the Lufenian people were saying before you get the Rosetta Stone. It turns out it's not that much. In the NES version, they exclusively say Lu Pa, and then the PSP version they all say Lu Pa Gamhi Do. Now, this honestly does my head in. I like the idea of recovering a lost language to connect with these new people and proceed with the story, but something about what they say before you speak to them just eats away at me. By all accounts, this Lu Pa is just gibberish, and it doesn't actually mean anything. Think of it like a dialogue placeholder until you can actually speak with them. Then why was it added to in later versions? Look, I understand that they might have just added more gibberish to make it seem more like a legit language that has more than only 2 syllables, and I get that that is probably the case, but a part of me can't shake the idea that it's somehow meant to mean something. I can't find any etymological basis for these words that would make contextual sense, but if you have any theories about this, however wild or baseless, please leave them in the comments. I'd love to know. In terms of linguistics that we can actually solve though, I'd like to look at the name change from Lefane to Lufenia that we've seen a few times now. Again, we're going to get our old friend Katakana out for help. This is technically the most confusing katakana we've looked at yet because of this small eh sound, but what this basically ends up being translated as is Lufane. This ends up being about halfway between both of the English translations we've seen in-game, and if anything is a smidge closer to the former, just like with Coneria and Cornelia. So what's with the change? There are likely 2 main reasons why this was adapted. Firstly, to make the name of the language sound a bit less forced. In English, there are a few common morphemes that we use to denote that something is a language, with ish being one of the most ubiquitous. However, having the language be called Lefanish is a bit like Finnish being called Finlandish, or Swedish being called Swedenish. It doesn't sound great. So many language names act more of a cross between the country name and one of these morphemes, which is why Lufenian works. It fits comfortably into our real-world examples too, unlike Lefanish. So Romania speaks Romanian, Bulgaria speaks Bulgarian, Lufenia to Lufenian. This change helps the English translation just sound a bit more natural. The second reason is simply because Lufenia sounds much more like an ethereal and mysterious fantasy location than Lefane, right? If you had to guess which one of those was more likely to be in a fantasy setting like this, you would totally pick Lufenia. Or at least I hope you would, or this point doesn't end up doing much for me. So, with this language learned, we've managed to obtain the item that lets us into our final sci-fi inspired dungeon, the Flying Fortress. One thing you've probably noticed throughout this video is that I haven't spent much time at all talking about the boss fights themselves, and the unfortunate reason for this is that they just aren't actually that interesting. They're all relatively short, not too difficult compared to the toll it takes you to reach them, and none of them have any specific mechanics or tactics that make them noteworthy. Unfortunately, this all also applies to Tiamat, the Fiend of Wind. The fight is more challenging than any that have come before, but still not really remarkable as an isolated incident. However, most of these dungeons do contain something interesting or worthwhile, and Tiamat's Flying Fortress is thankfully no exception to that. One of my favourite things to do in future Final Fantasy games is hunt down ultimate weapons. I absolutely adore the concept of super powerful hidden weapons existing that you've somehow got to try and unlock, or discover, or whatever, and the origin of this concept can technically be found in Final Fantasy I. In the Flying Fortress, you can find an item called Adamant, or Adamantite in the PSP version. Bear in mind alongside this that this is one of the very last dungeons in the game. Before you even do the first fiend fight against the Lich, you can talk to one of the dwarves in the Dwarf Cave, who says he can make you a legendary sword, but he would need some adamant. If you manage to keep this one random bit of dialogue in your head all the way up to finding this item, you can take it back to him and be rewarded with Excalibur, which is up to this point the strongest weapon you can come across by a distance. And again, with Excalibur, you can see the folkloric influence that Final Fantasy draws from so heavily, with the inspiration being from Arthurian legend this time around. As Ultimate Weapon quests go in the Final Fantasy series, this is very rudimentary and only really has one stage to it, but this game is more about sowing seeds that later games are going to reap to great effect. It's hard to bash it too much, being the very first instance of it within the entire series. But yeah, there we have it. The 4 fiends are defeated, so the game is over, right? Wrong. In the Flying Fortress, you get the opportunity to look through this window, through which you can somehow see the whole world. It makes it a bit clearer with this small animation in the PSP version that the 4 fiends you fought all existed at 4 separate corners of the map, and their energies all converge at one central point. This point is the Temple of Fiends, or the Chaos Temple depending on which version you're playing. What makes this important though, is that this is the very place that we fought Garland right back at the beginning. So here we find out that everything else we've done in this game so far has actually been building towards a little bit of story to close things off. But it's a bit of a mindfuck, so I'm going to try and explain it as best I can. After restoring all 4 crystals, or orbs, you can head back to the town Crescent Lake, and these sages on screen will give you some info about what you need to do now. One of them tells you that the time has come to destroy the source of all evil, and another asserts that with the 4 orbs shining again, the time gate can be broken. The true enemy is 2,000 years in the past. I'm sorry, but what? Are you taking the piss? Up to this point, the game had not even given you the slightest indication, not a single iota, that we were going to be ending this off with time travel, of all things. Another guy says that time is repeating. In order to break the time loop, you must eliminate the enemy who controls from 2,000 years in the past. And someone else says that someone travelled to the past and sent the fiends forward in time. Who's the final boss in this game meant to be? Fucking Jonas Kahnwald or something? Let's be honest, this time loop stuff has really come out of nowhere, but the basic premise is that Garland, the pushover you mess up at the beginning, is actually the big bad boss, and was sent back in time 2,000 years by the 4 fiends. From 2,000 years in the past, Garland, now able to transform into Chaos, some sort of super demon, sends the 4 fiends back into the future to make sure they send him back into the past, and continue this time loop eternally. Look, I'm gonna be honest, I'm not really into this. It's a cool idea, yeah, but the execution of it is so muddy that it ends up adding little but confusion to the end of the game. Yeah, the story ending where it starts is cool, everyone's a sucker for a good old-fashioned cyclical narrative, but I think the story of the game culminating in this way makes it seem kind of incongruent with everything before it. As usual, the ideas underpinning this game are often more interesting than what it actually does, and this leads me into my final proper tangent of this whole video: 4 crystals. Earlier on, I mentioned that 4 elemental crystals governing the natural world is about the most cliched JRPG trope you could ever find, and I'm gonna stand by that. What I didn't talk about at the time though is why that simple concept has endured so much throughout both the lifespan of Final Fantasy and JRPGs as a whole. It comes down to an ancient notion that we would most likely call the classical elements. These are typically earth, water, wind, and fire. This is an idea which exists in various guises and forms all across the world and has done for eons, and you can recognise it in modern media all the time too. Specifically though, considering this game is Japanese, I'd like to talk about how this applies more explicitly to Japan. In Japan there is a concept called the Godai, which literally translates to 5 great, and refers to the 5 elements. Now, you're probably thinking something along the lines of, I'm not sure this guy can count, he's added an extra element. But hear me out. Within the Godai, 4 of the elements are as we previously stated: earth, water, wind, and fire, but there is also a 5th element, most often translated to something along the lines of void or ether. Whilst the previous 4 elements are more tangible, the 5th element here refers more to that which is empty, or made up of energy, the intangible. So why am I bringing this up in reference to a game which has 4 crystals? I've got a surprise for you. There are 5 crystals. In order to enter the time loop in the Temple of Fiends, you have to shine the light of the 4 crystals onto what the NES version calls the Dark Orb, or the Black Crystal in the PSP version, and thus open the portals 2000 years ago. I'm pretty sure that this Black Crystal, or whatever you want to call it, is meant to represent this 5th intangible element of the void. Although the creative license has been taken to make dark crystals often synonymous with evil throughout the Final Fantasy series, it isn't so much like that in reference to the original Godai context. Void is just an opposite, if you will. It's space, a lack of anything else. And from a thematic perspective, this perfectly sums up what Final Fantasy I is actually about. The 4 elemental crystals represent order, and in turn, goodness. The antithesis of this tangible goodness is most easily represented by an intangible evil, which is where the 5th, untouchable, and most arcane element comes into play. Final Fantasy is using some of the oldest human concepts surrounding nature to frame its good and evil story. And this is fantastic because it's so simple. Final Fantasy represents evil as an absence of light, as all-consuming emptiness, and makes the concept of goodness physical to emphasize the difference between you and your enemy. It's fantastic, and ends up being the foundation on which Final Fantasy develops its entire identity. So with all that, we go back in time, absolutely batter chaos, and sever the time loop once and for all. Given that time loop stories are always super clear and obvious, the game ends by re-explaining everything that just happened. The main takeaway from this whole ending can be seen here, as it states that everything that you've just done in the game now pretty much won't happen because you broke the time loop, so the events in this game technically never took place. It's a weird, pretty thankless ending, apart from this one other screen that confers upon you the honour of truly being a light warrior. But otherwise, that's it. Final Fantasy I is over. So let's have one final wee chat about it, eh? I basically said it at the very beginning of the video, but the Final Fantasy series is my absolute favourite thing in the world. I cannot adequately express, no matter how hard I try, just how much I care about these games. It just wouldn't ever be enough. Final Fantasy I, the first game in the series, is not one of my favourites. It is a fascinating game though, one of the most important and influential games in video game history, and puts in a lot of the groundwork that allows the series to flourish later on. It's a game that deserves attention and analysis, and I really, sincerely hope that I managed to do this mammoth of the genre even the slightest bit of justice. If you followed me for a while, you might know that I've been working on this video for a very long time, and I cannot express how relieved and pleased I am to finally release it. This has been a labour of love more so than anything I've ever created. In case you don't know, I have a chronic illness, a problem with my spine, and it's really gotten in the way of making this, so I am beyond ecstatic and immensely proud to be able to finally share this with you. And I also can't wait to share the rest of the series with you too, because the best that Final Fantasy has to offer is definitely yet to come. Just one more thing. I know this is a little bit cheeky, but I've just recently launched a Patreon account, and if you enjoyed this video, or maybe feel like you learned anything new, it would mean the world to me if you would perhaps just check it out. Of course, this is by no means an obligation, and I won't ask any more than just having a look. And there we are. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I cannot adequately articulate how grateful I am for your support and patience, and I hope I did you all proud. If you enjoyed this, please consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel if you aren't already. You could even follow me on Twitter if you want more frequent updates from me, the link to that is in the description. I'd love to hear what you have to say in the comments, and if you could also share this video around with anyone who you think might be interested, that would be absolutely brilliant. Thank you everyone, and see you next time.